The attic smelled like old wood and something faintly metallic, like a penny held too long in a damp palm. I wouldn't have gone up there if it weren't for the storm outside. The wind howled, and the rain lashed against the windows, but the creak in the ceiling was louder than any thunderclap. Think you know how this story ends? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales. I told myself it was probably nothing, probably a loose floorboard or a squirrel looking for shelter. But curiosity doesn't come with an off switch, does it? So, with a flashlight in one hand and a broom in the other, just in case, I climbed the rickety ladder that groaned under my weight. Who even uses an attic anymore? I muttered under my breath, the kind of thoughtless complaint that fills the space when you're trying to distract yourself. But as I pushed open the hatch and poked my head through, I realized something was off. The air was heavy, like it had been trapped there for decades. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing cobwebs and a sea of forgotten junk. Boxes labeled in fading marker, an old rocking chair missing its cushions, and a trunk. That trunk. It was the first thing I noticed, sitting dead center like it had been waiting for me all along. The metal corners were rusted, but the lock gleamed unnaturally bright, almost as if someone had polished it recently. My gut told me to go back down, close the hatch, pretend I hadn't seen it. But storms don't last forever, and neither does bravery. So, against all better judgment, I stepped forward, the floor creaking beneath me like an unspoken warning. I wasn't supposed to be here, not really. This was my grandfather's house, or it had been until he passed. I'd inherited it months ago, but I hadn't had the time or energy to deal with its cluttered corners. Something about sorting through a person's life feels too close to stealing their memories, doesn't it? Still, when the roof started leaking, I had no choice but to come. I figured I'd stay a few nights, patch it up, and leave. That was the plan, simple as that. What no one told me, though, was that my grandfather wasn't exactly the sentimental type. There were no family photo albums, no dusty knickknacks from years gone by. It was as if he'd scrubbed his past clean, leaving only this house and that chest. The flashlight flickered, and I froze. Cheap batteries, I whispered to no one. But the moment passed, and the light steadied. I let out a shaky laugh, embarrassed by my own nerves. It was just a chest, old, heavy, harmless, until I noticed the scratch marks. They weren't obvious at first. Tiny grooves etched into the lid, overlapping in chaotic patterns, some deeper than others, some deliberate, like someone had tried to claw their way in. Or out. Don't be ridiculous, I told myself, but my fingers hovered over the lock. The gleam was almost hypnotic now, pulling me closer. I bent down, inspecting it. No keyhole, no latch, nothing that made sense. Then the sound came, soft, barely audible, like a whisper through clenched teeth. Help me. And that's when I realized, storms aren't the only things that trap you. Sometimes, it's the things you let yourself believe. I should have walked away. I should have closed the hatch and gone back to the creaking ladder. But when you hear someone, or something, begging for help, it's hard to turn your back, isn't it? I wasn't ready for what came next. Not even close. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the chest. The whisper had been so faint, I could have convinced myself I imagined it. Almost. But the attic felt different now. Heavier, colder, and quieter than it had any right to be. Even the storm seemed to have paused, like it was holding its breath along with me. I forced myself to take a step back, but my heel knocked against something. I turned and saw a folded piece of paper lying in the dust. It hadn't been there before. "Grandpa," I whispered. Half a joke, half a plea. No response, of course. I bent down to pick it up. The edges were frayed, and the ink had faded, but the handwriting was precise deliberate and oddly formal. Rules: do not open the chest at night. If you hear a voice, do not speak back. Never touch the chest with bare hands. Always use gloves. Do not move the chest from where it sits. If the lock disappears, leave immediately and never return. I read the list twice, then a third time, my heart pounding harder with each pass. It had to be a joke, some twisted prank left behind by my grandfather. But why? The man had never been one for games, let alone something this specific. The attic's dim light seemed to press in around me. My eyes darted to the chest, and I half expected the lock to vanish right then and there. But it didn't. It sat there, quiet, still, and somehow more menacing than before. I laughed nervously, a weak attempt to push down the knot of fear tightening in my chest. Right? Gloves. Of course, I muttered, trying to make sense of it all. What kind of chest needed rules? My hands were trembling as I folded the paper and shoved it into my pocket. This is ridiculous, I told myself, but the rules stayed lodged in my mind, each one scratching at my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. I reached for the chest instinctively, then froze. The third rule: always use gloves. Fine, I muttered, fumbling in the dark until I found a pair of dusty work gloves hanging off an old nail. They were stiff and smelled like mildew, but they'd have to do. Sliding them on, I crouched down and hesitated. Something about this felt wrong. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but something else, curiosity, stupidity, or both, kept me there. I placed my hands on the chest. The moment I touched it, a shiver ran through my arms, like I'd grabbed a live wire. I yanked my hands back and stumbled, nearly falling into the rocking chair. The paper crinkled in my pocket, grounding me. I pulled it out again and read the rules one more time, slower this time. Do not open the chest at night. I glanced at the small attic window. The storm clouds hid the moon, but I could tell it was still late. I didn't dare look at the chest again. Instead, I backed away, step by step, until my foot hit the ladder. The attic hatch felt heavier than it had when I'd opened it, but I slammed it shut and hurried downstairs, my heart racing. By the time I reached the kitchen, the paper was damp with sweat. I spread it out on the table and stared at it like it might reveal some hidden answer. The rules were bizarre, yes, but there was something else, something unspoken. Why couldn't I touch it with bare hands? Why not open it at night? And what did it mean if the lock disappeared? I couldn't shake the feeling that the rules weren't there to protect the chest. They were there to protect me. I spent the next hour pacing the house, turning the folded paper over in my hands. I wanted to burn it, pretend it didn't exist. But the weight of the attic, the weight of the whisper, hung heavy in the air, and I couldn't ignore it. When I finally sat down to catch my breath, I realized something else. The storm had stopped. The house was silent. Too silent. That's when I heard it again. Help me. This time it wasn't faint. It was clear, insistent, and coming from the attic. I should have run. I should have left right then and there. But something inside me wouldn't let go. The rules, the chest, the voice, they weren't going to let me leave that easily. And I wasn't ready for what was waiting upstairs. I don't remember deciding to go back up. Maybe it was the voice, clearer this time, or maybe it was the rules themselves gnawing at me like a splinter under the skin. Whatever it was, I found myself standing at the base of the attic ladder again. Flashlight in hand, the folded list of rules crumpled in my pocket. The whisper had felt too real to ignore. It wasn't my imagination. Couldn't have been. But the thought of climbing back into that suffocating, dust-filled space made my stomach twist. Just check, I muttered to myself, trying to inject some logic into the madness. If nothing's there, you'll sleep easier. The ladder creaked as I climbed, each step echoing through the empty house. When I reached the hatch, I hesitated. My fingers brushed against the edge, and for a moment, I thought about turning back. But that voice wouldn't let me. I pushed the hatch open. The attic was just as I'd left it. Dim, cluttered, and filled with that unsettling stillness. The chest was still there, sitting in its spot like a forgotten relic. The lock hadn't disappeared, thankfully, but something else was different. The rocking chair had moved. It wasn't where I'd seen it before. Now it sat facing the chest, its faded wooden frame casting a long shadow in the flashlight's beam. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The chair wasn't just out of place, it was rocking, back and forth, slowly, rhythmically. "Wind," I whispered, though I didn't believe it for a second. There were no open windows, no breeze to stir the air. I wanted to retreat, but my legs felt like lead. My eyes flicked to the chest, and I realized my flashlight's beam was trembling. Or maybe it was just my hand. The voice came again, louder this time, more distinct. "Please, help me. Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking. It wasn't bravery, it was panic spilling out before I could stop it. The attic didn't answer, but the rocking chair slowed to a stop. Every hair on my body stood on end. I took a shaky step back, my heel catching on the uneven floorboards. The flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I thought I saw something. A figure just out of reach, standing behind the chest. When the light steadied, the space was empty. "This is insane," I muttered, my words quick and shaky. "I'm imagining things. I haven't slept enough, that's all." But my eyes were drawn back to the chair, then to the chest. Something was wrong. Deep down, I knew it. I reached for the paper in my pocket and unfolded it with trembling fingers. The rules. I read them again, desperate for some sense of control, something to ground me. Rule 2. If you hear a voice, do not speak back. My stomach dropped. I'd already broken the rule. The realization hit me like ice water, and my mind raced. What happens now? I scanned the attic, looking for what? An explanation? A punishment? The silence pressed down harder. The rocking chair remained still, its shadow stretching like a warning. My flashlight flickered again, and I cursed under my breath, slapping it against my palm. Then I saw it. The chest. The lock was different. It hadn't vanished, but it wasn't gleaming anymore. The metal had turned dull, almost black, like it had been scorched. And the scratches, the ones etched into the lid, looked deeper now. I didn't wait to find out what it meant. My fight or flight instinct kicked in, and I bolted down the ladder, slamming the attic hatch shut behind me. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might burst, but I didn't stop running until I was in the kitchen, the list of rules clutched in my sweaty hand. For a few minutes, I just stood there, gasping for air. The voice, the rocking chair, the lock. It all felt like a waking nightmare. I wanted to believe it was stress, exhaustion, or some sick trick my mind was playing on me. But deep down, I knew better. The rules weren't just bizarre instructions scribbled on a piece of paper. They were real, and I'd broken one. What scared me most wasn't the voice or the chair. It was the fact that the chest hadn't done anything yet. But the night wasn't over. The silence in the kitchen was unbearable. No hum of the fridge, no creaks from the old floorboards, just a suffocating stillness. I leaned against the counter, gripping the edge until my knuckles turned white. My mind replayed everything I'd seen in the attic, but no matter how I tried to piece it together, it refused to make sense. The paper with the rules was still in my hand, damp and crumpled from the grip I hadn't loosened since leaving the attic. My eyes drifted to Rule 2. If you hear a voice, do not speak back. I cursed under my breath. Great job following that one, I muttered bitterly. I tried convincing myself it was fine, that maybe the rules weren't as literal as they seemed. But deep down, I knew better. My grandfather hadn't left those instructions for nothing. Whatever I'd triggered, it was just beginning. The first sign came an hour later. I'd barricaded myself in the living room, flipping through TV channels at random just to drown out the quiet. Static, commercials, reruns of old sitcoms. They all blended together into a dull hum that barely kept my nerves in check. Then the power flickered. The TV cut out for a split second, plunging the room into darkness before the screen blinked back on. I froze, clutching the remote like a lifeline. The lights flickered again. This time they stayed out longer. 5 seconds. 10. I sat there in the dark, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. When the power finally returned, I saw it. The chest. It was on the screen. Not in the attic where it should have been, but in the living room. Right there, staring back at me through the TV like it had somehow pushed its way through the static. My breath hitched. I rubbed my eyes, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, a glitch in the signal. But the image didn't fade. It stayed there, unmoving, impossible. And then the screen cut to black. I scrambled off the couch, nearly tripping over the coffee table in my rush to get away. My first instinct was to head for the door, but my legs carried me to the kitchen instead, to the list of rules still lying on the counter. My hands shook as I smoothed the paper out, scanning the lines again, looking for something I'd missed. Rule 4. Do not move the chest from where it sits. I swallowed hard, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. I hadn't moved it. Had I? The attic hatch was still closed. I was sure of that. But the chest, it had shown up on the TV. I grabbed the flashlight again and made my way back to the attic ladder. My whole body protested the idea of going back up there, but I needed to know. I needed to see if it was still in its place. The ladder creaked as I climbed, every sound amplified in the dead quiet of the house. When I pushed the hatch open, I didn't immediately see the chest. My flashlight swept across the cluttered space, catching only shadows and forgotten boxes. It was gone. My stomach churned. My mind raced through every possibility, none of them comforting. I stumbled back down the ladder, heart pounding as I tried to figure out what to do next. That's when I heard it again. Help me. This time, the voice wasn't coming from the attic. It was downstairs. I followed the sound reluctantly, each step slower than the last. The voice grew louder, more desperate, until it led me to the living room. And there it was, the chest. It sat in the middle of the room, its dark surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. The lock was gone. My breath caught in my throat. The rules were clear about this. If the lock disappears, leave immediately and never return. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not with that voice still calling out, pleading for help. I stepped closer, the flashlight trembling in my hand. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The chest sat silent, unmoving, but I could feel it, like a presence radiating from it, pulling me closer. My hand reached out instinctively, but I stopped myself just in time. Gloves. I needed gloves. I ran to the kitchen, grabbing the old work gloves from the counter. When I returned, the chest hadn't moved, but the air felt heavier, denser. As I crouched in front of it, I noticed something new. The scratches on the lid weren't random. They formed a pattern, a crude, jagged outline of a hand. I hesitated, my mind screaming at me to stop. But the voice came again, more urgent than ever. "Help me, please." My hand hovered over the lid, gloved and trembling. I didn't know what I was expecting. I just knew I couldn't walk away. I lifted the lid. The moment I lifted the lid, the room seemed to exhale. A gust of cold air brushed past me, carrying a faint metallic smell, sharp and unnatural. My flashlight wavered, its beam falling inside the chest, revealing nothing. It was empty. For a split second, relief flooded through me. Maybe this was all in my head. Maybe I'd built up this chest, these rules, into something they weren't. But then I saw it. At the very bottom of the chest, faint and flickering like a dying flame, was a shadow. It wasn't cast by anything. It moved on its own, twisting and writhing like it was alive. "Help me!" The voice was louder now, sharper. It wasn't a plea anymore. It was a demand. I stumbled back, the lid slipping from my hands and slamming shut with a sound that echoed through the house. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the walls themselves were closing in. My chest tightened, and I could barely breathe. Then came the footsteps. They were slow at first, deliberate, like someone testing each step. They echoed from the hallway, growing louder with every second. "Who's there?" I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the silence that followed. The footsteps stopped. I gripped the flashlight, its faint beam the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. My eyes darted to the chest, now sealed and still, and then to the doorway. My mind raced. Run. Hide. Do something. But I couldn't move. The sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps, heavy and purposeful, heading straight for the living room. I dove behind the couch, crouching low and clutching the flashlight to my chest. My breath came in shallow bursts, each one louder than the last. The footsteps stopped just outside the room. And then the voice. It wasn't the faint whisper from before. It was deep, guttural, and angry. "You broke the rules." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping, praying, that this was some awful dream. The floor creaked. Whatever was outside was in the room now. I didn't dare look, but I could feel it, a presence looming and suffocating. The voice came again, this time from behind me. "Why didn't you listen?" I spun around, the flashlight slipping from my grip and rolling across the floor. For a moment, the beam caught something. A figure tall and gaunt, its face obscured by shadows. And then it disappeared. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking beneath me. The flashlight had stopped rolling, its beam now fixed on the chest. The lid was open again. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, to leave the house and never look back. But the voice, that voice, held me in place. "Help me," it said again, softer now, pleading. I edged toward the chest, each step heavier than the last. My mind screamed at me to stop, to turn back, but my feet kept moving. When I reached the chest, the shadow inside was gone. In its place was something worse. A hand. It wasn't human. The fingers were too long, the skin too pale, like it had been drained of life. It gripped the edge of the chest, pulling itself up, inch by inch. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't real." But it was. The thing emerged slowly, its body impossibly thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a blur, like it couldn't decide what shape to take. "You let me out," it said, its voice a low rasp. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. "Stay away," I shouted, my voice cracking. It didn't listen. The thing took a step forward, then another. I grabbed the flashlight, shining it directly at the creature, but the beam passed through it like it wasn't even there. "You broke the rules," it said again, its voice colder now, angrier. My back hit the wall, and I realized I had nowhere to go. The thing was inches away, its distorted face leaning closer. In that moment, something snapped inside me. The fear, the panic, It all boiled over into a single thought. I won't go down without a fight. I grabbed the chest's lid, slamming it shut and trapping whatever part of the creature was still inside. It screamed, a sound so inhuman it felt like nails dragging across my skull. The walls shook, and the air grew impossibly cold. But I didn't let go. I pressed down with all my strength, ignoring the pain shooting through my arms. The thing thrashed against the chest, its limbs clawing at the floor, but slowly, it began to weaken. The screams faded, replaced by a low, guttural growl, and then silence. The chest was still again, its lock reappearing as if nothing had happened. I collapsed to the floor, my whole body trembling. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the chest. The rules had been broken and I'd survived. But I knew, deep down, I wasn't safe. Not yet. The voice might have been silenced, but the house felt alive now, watching, waiting. And I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The house was silent again, but it wasn't the comforting kind of quiet. It was heavy, oppressive, like the air itself was pressing down on me. The chest sat in the center of the room, motionless and locked, as though nothing had happened. I stayed on the floor for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to think. My mind was a blur, replaying the events over and over, but none of it made sense. The shadow, the voice, the thing. I'd seen it all with my own eyes, yet it defied everything I thought I understood about the world. When I finally got to my feet, the weight of the rules felt sharper than ever. I hadn't followed them, not completely, and now the house felt different, changed in a way I couldn't explain. I told myself I'd leave, pack a bag, get in my car, and drive as far away as I could. But something held me back. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was stupidity, or maybe it was the chest. It seemed to watch me, though it had no eyes, no face, just that cold, lifeless surface. The scratches were gone now, the lock back in place, but I could still feel it. It wasn't just an object anymore. It was something alive. The voice didn't come again, but its echo lingered in my mind. Help me. I wanted to believe it was over, that I'd won, but deep down I knew better. The next morning I forced myself to leave. The chest stayed in the living room. I didn't dare move it back to the attic. I locked the front door and walked away, hoping that distance would give me peace. Didn't. Even as I drove away, the house loomed in my rearview mirror like a shadow I couldn't shake. Every creak, every whisper of the wind, felt like a reminder. The chest was still there, waiting, and it wasn't done with me. Weeks passed, but I couldn't escape it. The feeling of being watched, the weight of the rules, the voice. It all followed me no matter where I went. Nights were the worst. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced I'd hear footsteps outside my bedroom door. I tried to move on, tried to forget, but forgetting wasn't an option. The chest had left its mark on me, in ways I didn't fully understand. I survived, yes, but I wasn't whole. I wasn't free. Even now, as I write this, I can feel it. Not the chest, but something else. A presence, faint but steady, watching from the corner of the room. I've thought about going back, about opening the chest one last time, just to see if it would end the torment. But I can't, because some rules aren't meant to be broken twice. Ready for more chills and mysteries? Subscribe and turn on the bell. You never know what story is coming next.